Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your quiet companion for an evening of careful thought. Tell me, is there a lamplit near you tonight? Perhaps a cup of something warm, the faint sound of rain against the glass, a moment stolen from the busier world. These are the hours Watson valued most deeply. Ink drying on a considered sentence, the mind settling like still water. Do subscribe so no chapter goes unshared. Now, make yourself comfortable. For as Holmes observed, one must first learn to be silent before one learns to truly see. Chapter 1. The House of Withering Vale. It is not often that a man may claim with precision the hour at which a mystery enters his life. Yet I can state with some confidence that the affair of Withering Vale began for me on a Thursday morning in early November, when the first cold fogs of the season had settled upon Baker Street like a grey and indifferent shroud. I had called upon Holmes that morning with no particular purpose beyond the agreeable habit of companionship, and found him standing at the window in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his pipe unlit, his gaze fixed upon the street below with the particular quality of attention that told me his mind was already occupied elsewhere. "You have come at a fortunate moment, Watson," said he, without turning from the glass. "There is a telegraph upon the mantelpiece which arrived not 20 minutes ago. You may read it while I dress." I took up the slip of paper and read it with growing interest. It was from a Mr. Lionel Gray, solicitor of Gray's Inn, and it requested Holmes's presence with some urgency at Withering Vale, a private estate situated near Petersfield in Hampshire. The message was brief to the point of obscurity, mentioning only that Sir Alistair Denholm, the owner of the estate, lay gravely ill, that certain matters of a delicate nature had arisen in connection with his affairs, and that no other counsel than Mr. Sherlock Holmes was considered adequate to the occasion. "You know the name?" I asked, when Holmes reappeared from his bedroom, already transformed into the precise, energetic figure I knew so well. Sir Alistair Denholm, Baronet, Hampshire. An old family, not without influence, but not without difficulty either. He has had 3 children by 2 wives, holds considerable land in trust, and has spent the better part of a decade in legal correspondence with his own solicitors. He paused to draw on his gloves. "The question of who benefits from his estate has, apparently, never been settled to universal satisfaction. And you propose to go?" "I propose that we go," said he, with that faint correction which always carried a particular warmth beneath its briskness. "Put on your heaviest coat, Watson. The Hampshire hills in November are not sympathetic to the unprepared." We took the 11 o'clock from Waterloo and arrived at Petersfield by early afternoon, where a carriage had been sent to meet us. The drive to Withering Vale occupied the better part of an hour, and I confess that even in the grey season the countryside possessed a melancholy beauty that suited the journey well. The lanes narrowed as we climbed, the oaks thinning to bare and tortured shapes against the low sky, until at last the gates of the estate appeared before us, yea, wrought iron and imposing, flanked by stone pillars from which moss had begun its slow campaign of occupation. The house itself was of the Jacobean period, I judged, a long and stern-faced building of dark Hampshire stone, set about with formal gardens that had seen better attention in more prosperous decades. It commanded a shallow valley, and the village of Withering lay half a mile below, its church spire just visible through the bare trees. Standing in the porch to receive us was Mr. Lionel Gray himself, a thin, precise man of 50 or thereabouts, whose demeanour suggested the habit of caution in all things. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm deeply grateful you have come so promptly." He shook our hands with a firmness that seemed intended to convey confidence he did not wholly feel. "Sir Alistair is somewhat improved since this morning, though Dr. Hurst will not commit himself on the prognosis. He insists upon seeing you, Mr. Holmes, at the first opportunity." "Then let us not delay," said Holmes. "But before I am taken upstairs, perhaps you will be good enough to give me a general account of the household." Mr. Gray led us into a sitting-room of considerable proportions, where a fire had been built up against the chill. He spoke quietly and with evident care for each word, as a man accustomed to professional reserve. Sir Alistair, he explained, had been unwell for some weeks, and had latterly become preoccupied with his affairs in a manner that exceeded his ordinary interest. He had recently dictated what he called a necessary amendment to his existing will, though Mr. Gray was at pains to point out that no formal codicil had been lodged with the office, and that he himself had not been present at its composition. The household, as Gray described it, was a complex one. Edmund Denholm, the eldest son by Sir Alistair's first marriage, was a man of 35 who managed the estate with competence if not distinction. He was, Gray admitted carefully, under some financial strain, the nature of which he declined to specify. Clara Denholm, the daughter from the same marriage, was unmarried at 28, a circumstance which the family treated as a matter of active rather than resigned concern. The second Mrs. Denholm, Margaret, was a woman considerably younger than her husband, and had brought to the marriage a son now aged 7, young Thomas, whose position in the household carried the usual delicacies that attend second families. Finally, there was Dr. Percival Hurst, the family physician, a man who had attended Sir Alistair for a dozen years and maintained what Gray described, with precise understatement, as a close professional relationship. Each of them has something at stake, Holmes observed, when the solicitor had concluded. His voice was quiet and without inflection, as though he were noting a feature of the landscape rather than delivering a judgment. All families have something at stake when a patriarch lies ill, Gray replied, with a diplomat's instinct. Quite so, but in the ordinary family it is money. I observe from your hesitations, Mr. Gray, that in this family it is something more troublesome than money. Money may be divided. Reputations, as a rule, cannot. Gray looked at Holmes with an expression in which alarm and relief were equally mingled, but he said nothing more before conducting us through the panelled hall and up the broad staircase. Sir Alistair Denholm proved to be a large man, diminished by illness, with the broad jaw and heavy brow of a man accustomed to authority, and the sunken eyes of one from whom that authority is slipping away. He lay propped against his pillows with a dignity that I recognised as the particular effort of the very proud. Dr. Hurst, a compact sandy-haired man who watched us from the corner with a physician's professional neutrality, nodded as we were introduced. Mr. Holmes. Sir Alistair's voice was reduced but not extinguished. I am told you are a man who can hold a confidence. I can, said Holmes. I have occasionally been known to act upon one as well. Sir Alistair's lips thinned in what might have been a smile. Then I will tell you only this for now. I have taken a step that some in this house would prefer I had not taken. Whether that step survives my illness is a matter I wish to place in your hands. He paused to gather breath. There are those who will look upon my papers before I am cold, Mr. Holmes. I should like them to find you looking also. Holmes asked 3 questions, each brief and precise, concerning the arrangements of Sir Alistair's study, the hours at which the household ordinarily retired, and whether the key to the study was kept upon his person or elsewhere. Sir Alistair answered them with the directness of a man who had thought long about such details. As we descended once more to the lower rooms, I glanced at Holmes and saw upon his face not the animation of interest I had anticipated, but something quieter and, I thought, more guarded. The house lay around us in its November stillness, and the members of the household whom we passed in the corridors, Edmund with his careful nod, Clara with her swift and searching glance, Mrs. Denholm with a composure so complete as to seem almost studied, each acknowledged us with the correct civility of their station. No one wept. They watched one another, and they watched us, and the house held its breath. "Well, Holmes," I said when we had been shown to our rooms, "what do you make of it?" He stood at the window of the small sitting room that adjoined our quarters, looking out over the formal garden where the last leaves of autumn lay upon the gravel in disorderly drifts. "I make nothing of it yet, Watson. I observe only that the atmosphere of this house is not grief, though a man lies dying upstairs. It is something considerably more tightly wound than grief." He turned from the window. "Vigilance, I think, is the word. They are all waiting for something, and each of them is waiting alone." I said nothing, for I felt the truth of it, and the house outside our door was entirely and uncomfortably silent. Chapter 2. The Whispered Amendment. Sir Alistair Denholm was dead before morning. I learned of it at 6:30 when a light tapping at my door roused me from an uneasy sleep. It was Gray, already dressed and composed, though his face carried the particular pallor of a man who has not slept at all. He informed me in a low voice that Sir Alistair had been found unresponsive by his valet shortly after 5 o'clock, and that Dr. Hurst had confirmed the death at 1/4 the hour. The cause, Hurst had said, was consistent with the cardiac weakness already known to attend Sir Alistair's condition. There was, on the surface of it, nothing to question. Holmes was already up and dressed when I knocked upon his door. He received the news standing, his hands clasped behind him, his gaze directed at the cold grate. "Unexpected, and yet not impossible," he said. His appearance yesterday admitted the possibility. What was the condition of his study when discovered? Gray hesitated with the uncertainty of a man who had not thought to inquire about studies when confronted with a death. Locked, I believe. From the inside, Baines, the valet, was obliged to have it opened. Holmes turned at that with a sharpness that Gray clearly did not understand. Who opened it, and with what? The spare key. Kept in the butler's pantry, I'm told. Edmund fetched it. I saw Holmes's expression settle into a particular stillness, and I knew from long experience what that stillness meant. He said nothing further to Gray, but asked to be taken to the study at once. It was not yet 7 o'clock, and the house moved around us in the muted fashion of a household newly acquainted with death. Servants appearing and retreating in corridors, voices kept low, the ordinary domestic machinery thrown temporarily from its course. The study occupied a corner of the ground floor, its 2 windows looking out upon the side lawn and beyond it the kitchen garden wall. The room was substantial but not over-large, lined with bookshelves on 2 sides and dominated by a heavy oak desk set at an angle to catch the light from the nearer window. A fireplace occupied the wall to the left of the door, and it was to this that Holmes went first, crouching before it with his lens and examining the grate and the surrounding stone with a patience that I had long since learned not to interrupt. I took the opportunity to study the room myself. The desk was orderly in the manner of a man who valued method. A blotter of green leather occupied the centre, and upon it I could see, without requiring any particular investigative instinct, that the surface had been disturbed. Not disarranged in any violent sense, but disturbed as though papers had been moved and replaced, or perhaps removed altogether. An inkwell stood uncapped, which struck me as odd. Sir Alistair, if his valet was to be believed, had retired the previous evening before 9 o'clock. A man who uncaps his inkwell and does not recap it before sleeping either left his study in some urgency, or had not slept at all before returning to it in the small hours. "What do you find, Holmes?" I asked when he rose from the fireplace. "I find that whoever last cleaned this grate did so with unusual thoroughness," said he. "There is no ash, Watson, yet the evenings here are cold enough to warrant a fire. The fire-irons show recent use. Something was burned, and what remained was swept away with more care than a servant ordinarily bestows upon a morning's routine." He crossed to the desk, drew out his lens, and bent low over the blotter for some moments without speaking. "Come and look at this." I leaned in beside him. At first I saw nothing beyond the ordinary wear of a much-used writing surface, but as Holmes angled himself to let the pale morning light fall obliquely across the leather, I perceived what he had already noted. A very faint impression remained in the material, as though a pen had pressed upon a sheet of paper resting there with rather more force than usual, and the pressure of the letters had carried through. "Can you read it?" I asked. "Not as it stands, but I have methods." He straightened. "Later, Watson. For now, observe the windows." Both windows were latched from within. He tested each in turn, examining the frames and the ledges without, so far as I could determine, discovering anything of note. Yet he lingered at the left-hand window for somewhat longer than the right, and I noticed him examine the latch mechanism with particular attention before moving on. It was as we were completing our survey of the room that Mr. Gray reappeared in the doorway. his demeanour carrying a new and evidently uncomfortable freight of information. "I wonder, Mr. Holmes, whether I might speak frankly," said he. "I would be relieved if you would," Holmes replied. The solicitor entered and drew the door to behind him. Sir Alistair, as I mentioned yesterday, had spoken of an amendment to his will. I told you quite truthfully that no formal codicil was lodged with my office, and that I had not been present at its composition. What I did not tell you," he continued, measuring each word carefully, "is that a servant, one of the housemaids, came to me last evening in considerable agitation. She reported that she'd been passing the study door at some point after dinner, when she heard Sir Alistair's voice within. He was not alone," Holmes said. She could not identify a second voice. Indeed, she was not certain there was one. But she heard Sir Alistair say, quite distinctly, that it must not stand as it was. Gray paused. "Those were her words. It must not stand as it was." The room was quiet for a moment. From somewhere above us came the soft movements of the household going about its sad morning business. "And the codicil itself," Holmes said. "You have looked for it this morning?" "I have made inquiries." Gray's composure showed for the first time a slight fraying at its edges. "There is no trace of it. The will as originally drafted is intact, locked in Sir Alistair's strong box, to which I hold a duplicate key. But of any amendment, any separate sheet, any draft or notation bearing upon a change of his intention, there is nothing whatsoever." Holmes absorbed this without visible surprise. "Then let us be precise about what we know. Sir Alistair dictated or wrote something he considered a necessary correction to his existing arrangements. He is dead. The document embodying that correction has vanished, and the study in which he worked was found locked from the inside." He paused. "The question most people will ask is who stands to gain financially from the suppression of this document. That, Mr. Gray, is the wrong question." Gray blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The question," Holmes said, turning back to the blotter upon the desk, "is who stands to lose something that cannot be recovered by any reallocation of the money. Greed often announces itself. It is compelled by its nature to act clumsily." He ran one finger along the edge of the leather without quite touching its surface. "But disgrace is another matter. Disgrace is a quiet and careful enemy, and it acts in the dark." Gray departed shortly afterwards to attend to the formalities that death imposes upon its witnesses, and I was left alone with Holmes in the silent study. He returned to the fireplace once more, this time producing a small piece of white chalk from his waistcoat pocket, which he applied to the cleaned grate with the absorbed concentration of a man reading a manuscript in a language he has not yet fully mastered. "Do you believe Sir Alistair was helped to his death?" I asked quietly. Holmes did not look up. "Dr. Hurst has attributed his death to natural causes, and I have no present grounds to dispute that conclusion. A man in Sir Alistair's condition might die at any moment, or might linger for months." He paused. "What I believe is that someone in this house knew the codicil existed, understood its contents, found those contents inimical to their interests, and has since ensured that no copy of it will come to light." He rose from the grate, dusting his hands. "Whether the timing of Sir Alistair's death was of nature's choosing, or another's, is a separate question, and one which at present I cannot answer." I looked about the quiet room, the capped inkwell, the empty grate, the latched and silent windows. "It is a singular business," I said. "It is," Holmes agreed, "and it will become more singular yet, I think. Before it becomes simple." He pocketed his lens and his chalk, cast one final look about the study with the comprehensive attention that I had so often seen him bestow upon a scene he did not intend to visit again unprepared, and led the way back into the corridor, where the cold of the Hampshire morning waited for us, and the house continued its careful and watchful silence. Chapter 3. A Locked Study. The morning advanced with the slow reluctance of November, and the household of Withering Vale settled into the particular suspension that follows a death, when all the ordinary transactions of life are held in abeyance, and people move through their own rooms as though uncertain of their right to be there. Holmes said very little at breakfast, which we took alone in the small dining room adjoining our quarters, and what little he did say bore no relation to the matter at hand. He spoke briefly of the chalk deposits common to the Hampshire downlands, and at rather greater length of a monograph he intended one day to compose upon the subject of paper ash and its distinguishing characteristics under magnification. I had learned, over many years, that such apparent digressions were seldom without purpose. It was not until the breakfast things had been cleared and the servant withdrawn that he placed his hands flat upon the table and regarded me with the focused attention he reserved for moments when he had something to say that he wished to say precisely. "I should like to return to the study," said he, "and I should like to do so before the household takes it into their heads to have it set in order." We found the room undisturbed, which suggested either that the servants had been instructed to leave it, or that no one had yet summoned the resolve to confront it. The pale, mid-morning light fell through the unshuttered windows at an angle well suited to Holmes's purposes, and he set to work with the methodical efficiency of a craftsman who knows exactly which tool is wanted and exactly where it is to be applied. He began with the blotter. From his coat he produced a soft pencil of the sort used by draftsmen and proceeded to shade the depressed areas of the leather with the lightest possible touch, working from the edges inward in a series of careful strokes. I watched over his shoulder as the technique yielded its result, the graphite catching upon the raised fibres of the undisturbed leather, while the compressed channels left by the pen remained pale against it. It was slow work and imperfect, but by degrees a fragment of legible impression emerged from what had been invisible. I could make out with effort portions of 2 lines. The first contained the word acknowledgement, clear enough, and beside it what appeared to be the abbreviated form of a date, though the month was indistinct. The second line was sparser and less recoverable, but the words before witnesses were unmistakable, and to their right, separated by a space that suggested a proper name had once occupied it. The letters on, or possibly un, which told me nothing with certainty. "Well," I said. "Well indeed." Holmes set down his pencil and studied the result with his lens for a long moment. "Acknowledgement, before witnesses. These are the words of a formal declaration, Watson, not of a financial disposition. A man who alters a bequest writes sums, names of beneficiaries, conditions of tenure. A man who writes acknowledgement and witnesses is making a statement of fact, not an instruction. A confession of some kind? Or a recognition? The two are related, but not identical." He capped his pencil and pocketed it. Someone wished this declaration burned, and was sufficiently determined to ensure that the burning was followed by the removal of all evidence of it. The swept grate was not the work of a hasty hand, Watson. It was done by someone who understood that ash retains form. I had not thought of that, though I recognised the truth of it immediately. Paper ash, if left undisturbed, preserves the ghost of its original character for some considerable time, the shape of the letters sometimes legible under careful examination. Whoever had swept the grate had known this, and had swept it to nothing. Holmes left the desk and turned his attention to the door. He examined the lock with care, working the mechanism several times with the key that remained in it, and then crouching to study the keyhole from below with his lens. He was at this occupation for several minutes, and when he rose his expression was thoughtful in a way I could not immediately interpret. "The lock is not forced," he said, "nor is it a particularly complex mechanism, a 5-lever mortise, and old at that. There are scratches about the barrel here," he indicated the interior plate of the lock with one fingertip, "that are consistent with the insertion of a thin implement but not with violence. Patient work? Rather. You mean the lock was manipulated from outside the door?" "I mean it is possible that it was. The scratches are not recent, which complicates the inference." He straightened and examined the door frame with equal attention. "What is rather more interesting is this." He pointed to the upper hinge, where I could see a slight deposit of a dark waxy substance at the pin. "Graphite. Not the ordinary kind, but a preparation of it mixed, I think, with tallow or similar. applied to silence the movement of the hinge. He pressed his finger to it and examined the result. Within the last day at most. So someone had prepared the means to open and close this door without sound. Someone had prepared for the possibility of requiring to do so. There is a distinction. He moved to the window he had lingered at the previous morning and examined it again. I now saw what I had missed before. Along the inner edge of the left-hand window frame, barely perceptible against the dark wood, a faint horizontal line scored into the paint, as though some implement had rested there under pressure. Holmes said nothing about it, but I observed him measure the height of it against his own hand before he moved away. We had been in the study perhaps 40 minutes when the door opened without ceremony, and Edmund Denholm presented himself. He was a tall man with his father's jaw, carrying himself with the deliberate straightness of someone who has decided that posture will serve where confidence cannot quite reach. He looked from Holmes to me and back with an expression in which I read more calculation than grief. "I had not been told you were here," he said. There was no particular accusation in it, but neither was there welcome. "We took the liberty," Holmes replied pleasantly. "I trust you will forgive the early intrusion. Your father was good enough to entrust certain matters to my attention, and I am merely attending to them." "My father is dead, Mr. Holmes," which makes the faithful execution of his wishes rather more important than less, I should think. Holmes smiled with the precise degree of warmth that closes a subject without offending its raiser. "You were not at dinner last evening, Mr. Denholm. I noticed your absence." The observation was delivered without particular emphasis, yet Edmund received it as though it carried rather more weight than Holmes had appeared to intend. A brief stiffness passed across his features. "I had business in Petersfield. I returned late." "Of course. By which road?" Edmund's eyes sharpened. "The Steep Lane Road. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity of the habitual kind," Holmes said equably. "Forgive me. It is an occupational failing." He glanced once more about the study with the air of a man satisfied that he had seen what he came to see. "Watson, I think we have concluded here for the present." Edmund stood aside to let us pass with a punctilious courtesy that did not quite conceal his relief. In the corridor, I noticed that the door to the small morning room which stood some yards along the passage was not fully closed, and that from within it came no sound at all, which is a different thing from emptiness. Holmes noticed it too. I saw his gaze rest upon that inch of gap for a fraction of a second, no longer, before he walked on. "Someone was listening," I said quietly when we had turned the corner. "Someone has been listening since we arrived," Holmes replied, with no more gravity than if he had remarked upon the weather. "The difficulty, Watson, is that in this house everyone has something they wish to hear confirmed, and everyone has something they are terrified of hearing at all." He said nothing more until we had reached the far end of the corridor, where a tall window looked out upon the kitchen garden, the vegetable beds brown and stripped, the paths between them edged with frost that the thin sun had not yet troubled itself to melt. "The room tells us a good deal," he said at last, a half to himself. "The door tells us a little more, and Edmund Denholm's face just now was not without instruction." He clasped his hands behind him in the attitude I associated with his deepest working concentration. "But the most instructive thing of all, I think, is what no one has yet asked." I considered that for a moment. "What do you mean?" "Not one member of this household, Watson, has inquired what the codicil contained." He turned from the window. "They are all content to know that it has vanished. Not one of them is curious about what Sir Alistair wished to say." His voice was even, but beneath it ran something I could only describe as gravity, the quiet weight of a man who has seen the shape of a thing not yet fully emerged from shadow. That is, in its way, the most significant observation I have made since we arrived. Chapter 4. The Reaction to Death. There is a discipline, not widely practised and less widely understood, which Holmes had on several occasions attempted to describe to me, and which I had come, through long observation, to recognise when he employed it. He called it, in one of his more expansive moods, the study of the secondary event. The primary event, he maintained, announces itself and requires no particular skill to perceive. It is the reaction to the event, the flinch or the stillness, the word suppressed or the glance redirected, that contains the intelligence worth having. On the morning following Sir Alistair's death, with the household gathered by necessity in the drawing-room awaiting the arrival of the county coroner's representative, I watched Holmes practice this discipline with the quiet concentration of a naturalist in a field he has chosen for its yield. He did not circulate. He took a chair near the window and remained in it, accepting a cup of tea from the servant who brought the tray, and appearing to all appearances merely to sit. I stationed myself near the fireplace, which afforded a view of the room equivalent in coverage, if not in angle, and endeavoured to observe alongside him, though I was conscious, as always, of the significant difference between watching and seeing. Edmund Denholm stood near the door to the hall, as a man stands when he is uncertain whether he wishes to be in a room, but considers departure inadvisable. He held his teacup without drinking from it. At intervals he looked toward the window, then to Holmes, then to the cup, in a rotation that struck me as the outward expression of an inward agitation he was working to suppress. When Gray entered and spoke briefly to him regarding the formalities of the death certificate, Edmund responded with the attentiveness of someone who is listening very carefully to the words rather than the substance, as though the language itself might contain a trap. He was anxious, I concluded. But I recalled Holmes's observation from our first evening, and I looked again with that in mind. What I did not see, and what I believe I would have seen in a man genuinely bereaved, was the particular quality of lostness that accompanies real grief. Edmund Denholm was not lost. He knew precisely where he stood. He was afraid of where that standing might be discovered to be. As Clara Denholm had placed herself upon a small sofa at the room's far end, where she sat with a straightness of posture that spoke of training rather than composure. She wore mourning dress with the correctness of someone for whom appearance and propriety are not merely habit but strategy. What occupied my attention, however, was not her dress but her hands. They lay folded in her lap in a posture of deliberate stillness, the left pressing down upon the right in a fashion suggesting that without the pressure, the right might not remain quiet. She looked at no one directly. When the servant entered, her eyes went to the door with a sharpness that softened immediately into polite indifference. She was, I thought, listening for something specific, something she expected to arrive. Mrs. Bois. Margaret Denholm had brought young Thomas to the room and settled him at a small table with a book he was not reading. She herself sat near him with the composed attentiveness of a woman who has decided that the most productive thing she can do is seen to be calm. It was a performance, but not an unfeeling one. There was genuine care in the way she occasionally touched the boy's shoulder, and genuine trouble in the set of her mouth when she thought herself unobserved. Gray, when he crossed the room and murmured something to her concerning papers that required attention before the week was out, received from her a nod of such precise and practised neutrality that it told me considerably more than a less controlled response might have done. Holmes, I noticed, had shifted his attention to Gray himself at this exchange, and Guillain held it there for longer than he had on any other individual. It was perhaps an hour into this quiet observation that Holmes set down his teacup, excused himself to no one in particular, and moved to the writing desk that occupied the alcove beside the bookcase at the room's eastern wall. It was not Sir Alistair's desk, but a secondary piece used, I supposed, by whoever in the household had occasion to write in the drawing-room. Holmes stood at it for a moment as though examining the view from that part of the room, and then bent, with what appeared to be casual interest, to look at the space between the desk and the wall behind it. When he straightened and rejoined me at the fireplace, he said nothing, but I saw him pat the left breast of his coat in the small confirming gesture of a man who has placed something into his inside pocket. The coroner's man arrived at 11:30, a conscientious fellow from Petersfield named Addison, who conducted his business with appropriate gravity and departed within the hour, satisfied by Dr. Hurst's account and finding no cause to complicate matters. The death, officially, was what it appeared. A man of compromised constitution whose heart had at last declined to continue. I could not, in honesty, argue otherwise on medical grounds. Yet I was aware, as Addison was not, of the swept grate and the silent hinge and the words pressed into the blotter leather. The family dispersed with Addison's departure, and it was only as the drawing-room emptied that Holmes touched my arm and drew me back to the desk in the alcove. "You found something earlier," I said. "A torn envelope." He produced it from his coat. It was a piece rather than a whole, roughly a third of a standard envelope, cream-coloured paper of moderate quality, and along its torn edge there adhered the remnants of a wax seal. The seal itself was incomplete, having been torn rather than broken, but enough of the impression remained to show a portion of what I took to be a heraldic device, and beside it, stamped into the wax, 2 letters that were clearly the beginning of a word or a name. It was behind the desk leg, Holmes said, which is to say it was not merely dropped but had worked its way there over some time or been pushed. The dust confirmed the former. "Ha, it has been there for several weeks, I should judge." He turned the fragment over. On the interior surface, at the extreme edge of the torn margin, there was a single word in a hand I did not recognise. It read merely, "Stand." "The housemaid's report," I said. "It must not stand as it was." "Possibly. Or possibly the word is coincidental," but his voice suggested he did not believe it coincidental. "The wax seal is the more immediately informative detail. It is not a solicitor's seal, nor a commercial one. It is a personal device, and the 2 letters visible are D and E." He held the fragment toward the light from the window, which, given where we stand, might conceivably be the beginning of Denholm. I turned the implications of that over in my mind. A sealed letter sent to or from the Denholm family weeks old, and found not upon the desk but behind it. A letter received perhaps rather than sent, since it was the envelope and not the folded contents that remained. "Someone read it and discarded it here," I said. "Or discarded it in haste, and it was not seen again until now." Holmes folded the fragment carefully into his pocket-book. "We must not overdetermine what we do not yet know. But I will tell you this, Watson." He glanced toward the door through which the family had withdrawn. "I have spent this morning watching 4 people respond to a death, and not one of them has responded in the same register. Edmund fears exposure of something practical. Clara fears gossip more than loss, and I do not mean that unkindly, for she has reason to, Mrs. Denholm's composure is maintained at a cost that speaks of specific rather than general anxiety. And Gray?" Holmes paused at that, which was itself an answer of a kind. "Gray," he said at last, "grows defensive in proportion to the delicacy of the question. It is the reflex of a man who knows more than he has said, and is not yet certain how much he must eventually surrender." He moved toward the door. "Greed often shouts, Watson. I believe I have said something to that effect before." "You have." "I say it again because I wish to impress upon you how deliberately I am not shouting in that direction." He paused in the doorway, and there was in his expression a quality of concentration that I had learned to respect absolutely. "The financial construction of this matter is a distraction. Someone has arranged for us to look at money because they know quite well that what they have protected has nothing to do with it." He stepped into the corridor and I followed, and the drawing-room settled behind us into its November quiet, the half-drunk cups still on their saucers, the fire burning down unattended, the torn fragment of envelope secure in Holmes's pocket-book, patient as a held breath. Chapter 5. Conversations in Confidence. The afternoon brought with it a change in the weather. The thin November sun, which had persisted without warmth through the morning's formalities, withdrew behind a bank of cloud moving in from the west, and by 2 o'clock a fine, penetrating rain had begun to fall upon the gardens and the lane. Holmes had spent the luncheon hour in our sitting-room with his pipe, and what appeared to be a state of complete inactivity, though I had known him long enough to understand that his stillness in such moments was the stillness of a mill-wheel turning in deep water, the visible surface calm, the mechanism below fully engaged. After luncheon he rose, put on his coat, and announced that he proposed to hold what he called, with characteristic understatement, a series of brief conversations. He asked me to accompany him and to say as little as possible, a instruction I received without offence, having received it a good many times before. My function on such occasions, as I had come to understand it, was not silence precisely, but the particular quality of attentive witness that Holmes found useful as a counterweight to his own method. He thought more clearly, he had once told me, when someone occupied the chair that would otherwise invite conjecture to sit in it uninvited. Edmund Denholm received us in the estate room, a practical chamber at the rear of the house lined with land maps and ledgers, where the business of a Hampshire property was evidently conducted with more order than profit. He sat behind a broad desk with the careful self-possession of a man who has prepared himself for a difficult examination, and Holmes, with a considerateness that I recognised as entirely strategic, opened with nothing more threatening than a question about the management of the lower fields. Edmund relaxed by almost imperceptible degrees. Then Holmes asked, without any alteration of tone, whether Edmund had been aware of any specific change his father had intended to make to the disposition of the estate. I was aware of nothing formal, Edmund said, meeting the question steadily. My father spoke in general terms, in the way that ill men sometimes do, about wishing things to be set right, but he said nothing specific to me. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds followed, and in that pause Edmund's right hand moved from the desk's surface to its edge and back. I will be frank with you, Mr. Holmes. I am a man with debts. I will not pretend otherwise. But my father's existing will is adequate to my situation, and I had no cause to wish it altered. He said it with the measured candour of a man who has calculated that a controlled confession serves better than a discovered one. Holmes thanked him, and we withdrew. Clara received us in the upstairs sitting room that overlooked the side garden, a bright and feminine apartment that struck me as rather more inhabited than the rest of the house's upper floor. She was at the window when we entered, and she turned with a composure that, at close quarters, cost her more than it had appeared to in the drawing-room. She was a handsome woman, and the intelligence in her face was of the kind that, in another era, might have found a more satisfying outlet than the management of social reputation in a Hampshire household. Holmes sat, and did not immediately speak. It was a technique I had observed him employ before, and its effect was invariable. The silence became the other person's responsibility, and they filled it according to their deepest concern. "I expect," Clara said at last, with a smile that didn't reach the level of her eyes, "that you wish to ask me about the will." "I had thought," Holmes replied pleasantly, "of asking you about your father." Whatever Clara had anticipated, it was not that. She looked at him for a moment with an expression of genuine surprise, and in that unguarded instant I saw, beneath the careful exterior, something very like grief. Not the fear I had catalogued that morning, but the simpler and sadder thing that had been living underneath it. "He was a difficult man," she said more quietly, "and a proud one, but he was not unkind in his way." She looked down at her hands, which in private she was apparently willing to allow their own movement. "He discovered some months ago something from my past that I would have preferred to remain buried, a matter of some years since. He was very angry for a time." She steadied herself with a small breath. "And then he was not angry. He told me that he had come to understand that he bore some part of the responsibility for the circumstances that had produced it, and that he intended to address that." Her voice had thinned to something near a whisper. "I did not know precisely what he meant to do. I am not certain I wish to know." Holmes asked one quiet question, whether she had any reason to believe her father had committed his intention regarding her to writing. She was silent for rather longer than the question required. "I feared he might have," she said at last. "He was a thorough man." We left her at her window and descended once more. Dr. Hurst, when Holmes found him in the small dispensary he had appropriated near the back of the house, was a more compact problem. He had the defensive alertness of a professional man who suspects that his professional judgments are about to be questioned, and he met Holmes's first inquiries about Sir Alistair's final hours with a technical fluency that was intended, I thought, to establish the primacy of his expertise before any challenge to it could be mounted. Holmes allowed him this. He asked nothing medical. Instead, he asked when Sir Alistair had last sent for him in the evening, and for what stated purpose. Hurst's fluency faltered briefly. He summoned me 2 evenings before his death. He said he wished to discuss a matter that was troubling him, not medically. And did he discuss it? He spoke of an injustice, Hurst said, and the word evidently tasted of more than its face value, an old injustice. He said that he had concealed a thing he ought not to have concealed, and that he was determined to set it upon the record before he died. He met Holmes's gaze with the directness of a man who has decided that candour will cost him less than it might. I told him that such decisions were his alone to make, and that I would respect whatever he chose to do. He thanked me and dismissed me. He paused. I was not surprised when I found him dead. His condition had been deteriorating for some weeks, but I will not pretend the timing does not strike me as unfortunate. Unfortunate, Holmes repeated without elaboration. I am a physician, Mr. Holmes, not an investigator. Hurst's voice had regained some of its professional evenness. I can only tell you what I observed. Holmes thanked him and did not press further. We sought out Mrs. Denholm last and found her in the nursery, which she had clearly retreated to as the one room in the house where her authority was uncontested and her position unambiguous. Young Thomas was asleep in the adjoining room, and she received us at a small table with a teapot and the resolute calm of a woman who has decided she will not be the one to lose her nerve. Holmes was at his gentlest with her, which I had learned was not a softening of his method, but a refinement of it. He asked after the boy's welfare and listened to her answer with what appeared to be genuine interest. Then he asked, with no more ceremony than he had given the question about Edmund's Fields, whether she had been aware of any uncertainty surrounding her marriage to Sir Alistair. The teacup she was holding did not rattle, but her grip upon it changed. There was no uncertainty, she said. We were married in the spring of '93. Thomas was born in the following January. She set the cup down. If anyone has suggested otherwise, they are mistaken. No one has suggested otherwise to me, Holmes said, but someone, I think, has suggested it to you. The pause before her reply was short, but it was there. My husband was a man who sometimes felt that the opinions of others required management, she said, with a careful precision. He had received a communication some months ago that he found troubling. I was not shown its contents, but his manner toward me changed after he received it, and then, in time, changed back. She looked directly at Holmes. He told me the matter was settled, that he was satisfied on every point, and that he intended to confirm it. To confirm it, Holmes said, in writing. He did not say so explicitly, but yes, I believed so. We rose to go, and I think she was grateful, though she showed nothing of it. In the corridor, Holmes walked in silence for some time, his hands in his coat pockets and his chin down, and I waited with the patience I had cultivated over many years of such silences. None of them seek gain, he said at last, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man confirming to himself what he had already suspected. Each of them seeks preservation. Edmund of his solvency, Clara of her name, Mrs. Denholm of her son's standing. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright and steady. They are each defending something they are afraid of losing, and only one of them had sufficient reason to act before the ink was dry. He said no more, and I did not ask him which one he meant. The shape of it was forming in my own mind, slowly, but with the solidity of a conclusion earned rather than assumed, and I had the feeling, familiar from other cases in other seasons, that we were very nearly at the hour when the thing would become visible entire. Outside, the November rain continued its patient work upon the gardens of Withering Vale, and the house held its breath around us still. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. Evening came early to Withering Vale, as it does to all deep-set houses in the latter weeks of November, the light failing by 4 o'clock and the shadows of the garden wall stretching across the gravel until they merged with the general darkness. We dined alone again, our Holmes and I, and he was quieter at table than I'd seen him since our arrival, which paradoxically suggested that he was making rather more progress than his silence indicated. I had remarked upon this quality of his before, that the further he advanced into the interior of a problem, the less he felt the need to furnish me with interim reports. The full account would come in its own time, delivered with the completeness and economy of a man who dislikes revision. After dinner, he produced his pipe and his notes, the latter comprising a small leather pocket-book in which he had made entries throughout the day in his cramped, precise hand, and he spent an hour in his chair reviewing them in the manner of a man checking the addition of a long column of figures. I read, or attempted to read, a volume I had found upon the shelf of our sitting-room, a natural history of the Hampshire Downs that might have interested me considerably under other circumstances. The rain had ceased, and the night was still, and Withering Vale lay around us in a quiet so thorough that the occasional creak of the old house's timbers was almost companionable. It was past 9 o'clock when Holmes set down his pocket-book and spoke. "Let us reconstruct the final evening," he said, not as a proposal but as an announcement that we were going to do so. Sir Alistair summoned Hurst after dinner. We have Hurst's account of that conversation, which I accept as substantially accurate, since a man who has decided upon candour does not usually qualify it in the middle register. He spoke of an old injustice. He spoke of a concealment he intended to remedy. Hurst departed, having offered no encouragement and no discouragement. That aligns with what Hurst told us. Shortly thereafter, Holmes continued, as though I had not spoken, though not discourteously, Sir Alistair dismissed his valet for the night. Baines has confirmed this to Gray. It was earlier than Sir Alistair's custom by approximately 1 hour. A man who dismisses his valet early is a man who wishes to be unobserved. He rose and moved to the window, not to look out, I thought, but from the habit of movement that accompanied this particular mode of thought. He then returned to his study. He uncapped his inkwell. He wrote, upon a single sheet of paper, a document that bore the character of a formal declaration. We know this from the blotter's evidence, acknowledgement, before witnesses. But there were no witnesses present, I said. The room was empty but for him. The document does not require witnesses to have been present at its composition, Watson. It requires only the declaration of intent that such witnesses would be sought. Or, alternatively, it might itself constitute the record of something Sir Alistair was asserting upon his own testimony to be witnessed subsequently. He turned from the window. The precise legal form matters less at this stage than the document's content. The content was declarative. It acknowledged something, and it was written in the study, alone, in the late hours, with the inkwell uncapped, by a man who had already told his physician that he meant to correct an old wrong. I considered the blotter fragment again in my mind. Acknowledgement, before witnesses, and the partial suffix that had evaded certainty, dash on, or dash un. The name, I said, the fragment of a name beside the date. Denholm, Holmes said quietly, or a diminutive of it. I have considered the possibilities, and none of them resolve more cleanly. Then the document concerned a member of this family specifically. It named one, yes. He picked up his pipe, found it empty, and did not trouble to refill it. Now consider the fireplace. No ash. The grate swept to bare metal. The fire irons showing use. The room was cold when we examined it, cold enough that a fire in the evening would not have been unusual, yet none had been laid. The irons were used not to manage a fire, Watson, but to manage what remained after one. He set the pipe aside. A single sheet of paper burns quickly, in a room already cold. A man might light a small fire in the grate for the sole purpose of destroying one document, and then sweep the grate afterwards with sufficient thoroughness to leave no readable trace. It is not a hasty act. It is a deliberate one, performed by someone who understood very well that evidence does not simply vanish because it is burned. As you noted earlier, I said, ash retains form, which is why the ash itself was swept away and the grate cleaned to stone. He was quiet for a moment. The discipline involved in that act is telling. Haste would have left remnants. What we found, or rather what we did not find, is the product of method. I thought of the greased hinge, the scored line on the window frame, the torn envelope behind the drawing-room desk. Each of these things, taken separately, might have been innocent enough, and taken together, and placed alongside the swept grate and the turned blotter impression, they composed a portrait of someone who had moved through Sir Alistair's final evening with forethought and economy, neither more nor less than the occasion demanded. "The locked door," I said. "You're satisfied that it was locked from within by the person who burned the document, and not by Sir Alistair himself?" "I am satisfied," Holmes said, "that the door's mechanism admits of manipulation from without, given patience and the right implement, which the scratches about the barrel suggest were applied at some earlier date, possibly in preparation for exactly this contingency. I am further satisfied that Sir Alistair, who was found by Baines to have died in his bed and not in his study, made his own way from the study to his room after completing his writing, and that whoever entered the study subsequently did so while Sir Alistair slept, and locked the door behind them upon leaving to preserve the impression of a room untouched. The implications of this settled upon me with a weight that was not quite discomfort and not quite relief, but something between the two. No crime of violence had been committed. A man had died naturally, as such men die, and another person had taken advantage of the interval between his retirement and his discovery to remove a document that threatened them. It was not murder, but it was not nothing either. "The question of what the declaration contained," I said carefully, "and who specifically it named, must determine who had the most immediate reason to destroy it." "Yes." Holmes sat down again and pressed his fingertips together in the arch that I associated with conclusions nearly complete. And here is where the weight of silence becomes instructive. Clara knew her father had discovered her past indiscretion, and feared he meant to commit his knowledge of it to paper. Mrs. Denholm knew a communication had disturbed her husband, and prompted him toward a written confirmation of her son's standing. Either of these, made formal and permanent, might become a document that others would eventually read. He paused. But Clara's indiscretion, however painful, was a private matter. Its formal acknowledgement by her father would have been protective in character. Removing the power of others to use it against her, she had more reason to want it written than destroyed. I waited. "Mrs. Denholm's situation is more complex," he went on. "A formal declaration of Thomas's legitimacy, while reassuring in intent, would necessarily draw attention to the very question of his legitimacy. It would place upon the public record the acknowledgement that the question had arisen. Marriage dates would be examined. The interval between wedding and birth, which falls within the bounds of decency but uncomfortably close to its margins, would invite arithmetic." He met my gaze. Sir Alistair, in his desire to do right by his son, may not have fully considered that the act of formal declaration can sometimes advertise the wound it intends to close. So the codicil, in seeking to protect Thomas, might have endangered him? Precisely. And the person most acutely alive to that danger, Holmes said, is the person who has spent 7 years managing every detail of that child's standing in this household and in this county. He rose again, this time with finality, and moved toward the door. "Tomorrow I wish to examine the path between the study window and the garden wall, and I wish, if it can be arranged, to speak with the housemaid who overheard Sir Alistair's words." He paused in the doorway, one hand upon the frame, and looked back at me with an expression that was almost, though not quite, regret. "She did not act from cruelty, Watson. Whatever else we conclude, she acted from love of a child. That consideration will not alter the facts, but it will, I think, alter everything else." The lamp burned low between us. And outside the windows, Withering Vale lay dark and very still, with all its secrets held close in the cold Hampshire night. Chapter 7. The Monetary Hypothesis. Morning brought a frost that had not been there the previous night. The gravel of the garden paths white and crackling underfoot. The formal hedges roomed with it, and the shallow valley below Withering Vale filled with a mist that the low November sun would be some hours burning off. I had slept better than I expected, and woke with the curious sensation, familiar from other investigations, that the night had done some of the work for me. certain elements of the previous day's accumulation had arranged themselves into something approaching order while I was absent from them, and I descended to breakfast with a clearer sense of the shape of things than I had possessed at the close of the previous evening. Holmes was already at the table, which was itself unusual, and had evidently been up for some time. He was in excellent spirits, or presented the appearance of them, which with Holmes amounted to the same thing in practical terms. He ate with appetite and spoke of nothing consequential, admired the Hampshire frost through the window with what seemed genuine appreciation, and waited until the servant had withdrawn before he produced from his waistcoat pocket a small folded note and placed it beside my plate. "This was delivered to Gray this morning," he said. "He was good enough to share its substance with me, if not its precise wording." The substance, as Holmes conveyed it, was this: a creditor in London, a firm of money-lenders of the less reputable kind, had written to Mr. Lionel Gray in his capacity as family solicitor to inquire, with the pointed delicacy of those who deal in such matters, whether the estate of the late Sir Alistair Denholm might be considered available to address certain outstanding obligations contracted by his son and heir, Mr. Edmund Denholm, in the sum of £3,400. I set down my coffee cup. £3,400. A considerable sum, sufficient in the hands of the right advocate to establish a compelling narrative. Holmes unfolded his napkin with deliberate neatness. The creditor's timing is, I suspect, coincidental rather than conspiratorial. These firms monitor the public announcements of deaths among families of property, with the regularity of a farmer checking the weather. Nevertheless, the arrival of this letter this morning, with the household still assembled and the will not yet formally read, has had an effect upon the atmosphere of this house that I observed with some interest during my earlier walk. You spoke to people this morning? I encountered Edmund in the corridor at 7:30. He had evidently slept poorly, and his manner toward me had changed overnight in a fashion I found instructive. Yesterday he was cautious. This morning he was watchful in the particular way of a man who suspects that others are discussing him. Holmes poured himself more tea. I then encountered Gray, who had received the letter and was composing himself to deal with it, and whose composure, I noticed, was somewhat more readily achieved than I might have expected in a solicitor confronted with evidence of his client's indebtedness, as though it confirmed rather than surprised. I understood the implication. If Gray had already formed a theory in which Edmund's financial desperation explained the disappearance of the codicil, the letter from the creditor served to cement that theory in a way that would have been privately satisfying to a tidy professional mind. "You think Gray has settled upon Edmund?" I said. "Gray has settled upon the most available explanation, which happens at present to be Edmund. The money-lender's letter has given him a number to attach to the motive, and numbers, in a solicitor's world, carry a particular persuasive authority." Holmes set down his cup. "I think we should allow this hypothesis a little air." I was not certain I followed him. "You mean you intend to do nothing to correct it?" "I mean I intend to allow it to run for a period, and to observe what it does to those who are not Edmund Denholm." His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. A false narrative, when released into a confined space, does not merely deceive, it reveals. Those who accept it readily are those to whom it is convenient. Those who grow uneasy are those who know its inadequacy. And those who relax, he said, with a particular emphasis upon the last word, are those who have most reason to be grateful that another explanation has presented itself. I considered this. It was not a method I could have employed without discomfort, and I was not entirely certain it sat easily with me even as a spectator. But I had learned, in the years of our association, that Holmes's willingness to manipulate a situation was always bounded by a precise sense of the harm that manipulation might cause, and I trusted that he had calculated this one accordingly. The morning unfolded in the manner he had predicted. By 10 o'clock it was apparent, from the small signals that circulate in any confined household, that the general current of suspicion had found a channel. A word between Gray and the housekeeper, overheard or inferred, A look exchanged between two of the upper servants at the sight of Edmund crossing the hall. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be called accusation, but the slow accretion of a shared supposition that required no statement, because it answered too many questions too conveniently to be resisted. And Edmund himself passed me on the stairs at 10:30 and stopped to inquire, with an abruptness that poorly concealed its anxiety, whether Holmes had reached any conclusions. I replied, with perfect truth, that Holmes had shared no conclusions with me that morning. Edmund received this with a nod that might have indicated satisfaction, or might have indicated suspicion that I was withholding something, and continued on his way. I observed Clara at the far end of the drawing-room that afternoon, seated with her needlework in the attitude she had adopted since her father's death, as a kind of portable composure, always occupied, never quite absorbed. She lifted her head when I entered and looked at me with the measuring attention that I was coming to associate with her, as though each person she encountered was being assessed for what they knew and what they intended to do with it. When I sat and made some unremarkable observation about the frost, she replied with appropriate pleasantry, but her attention had gone elsewhere before the exchange was half concluded. Mrs. Denholm I saw only briefly in the garden after luncheon, walking with Thomas along the kitchen garden path, with the contained purposefulness of a woman who has found occupation for herself in order to prevent stillness from becoming an occasion for thought. She nodded to me across the frozen beds without pausing, and the child walked beside her with his small hand in hers, oblivious, as children mercifully are, to the particular weight that the adults around him were carrying. I found Holmes in our sitting room at 3:00. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, and I settled in my chair and told him what I had observed. He listened without interruption, which was either a compliment to my account or an indication that it confirmed what he had already deduced, and most likely both. "And the household's general tenor?" he asked when I had finished. I considered my answer with some care. "Relieved," I said at last. "Or approaching relief, as though the arrival of a plausible explanation has loosened something that has been held tightly." "Yes," he turned from the window. I had the same impression. A narrative of greed is a great comfort to people who are afraid of something worse. It is familiar, it is finite, it places the difficulty in a comprehensible box and offers the hope of a comprehensible resolution. He sat down, and for a moment the energy that had animated him through the morning was absent, replaced by something quieter and more deliberate. Edmund Denholm is not a sympathetic figure in this household. He is the heir, which invites a degree of resentment, and he has managed the estate with the authority of ownership rather than stewardship, which invites more. A theory that casts him as the villain of the piece is a theory this household is predisposed to accept. And you believe it to be wrong. He looked at me for a moment, and in his expression I saw something that I had only rarely seen there. Not doubt, which was almost foreign to him, but a precise and considered reluctance, as though the truth of the matter, which he clearly already held, was a thing he wished to handle with particular care before he set it down in the light. "I believe," he said, "that Edmund Denholm is a man of debts and moderate character who has, in this affair, been handed a part in a drama he did not write and does not fully understand." He paused. "And I believe that the person who did write it is at this moment feeling, for the first time since our arrival, something very like safety." He pressed his fingertips together. "Which is precisely when I intend to take it away." The fire in the grate settled with a soft collapse of ash, and outside the frost held the garden in its grip, and I sat with the knowledge of what was coming, and found that I felt in equal measure the anticipation of resolution and the weight of what that resolution would cost. Holmes said nothing more that evening, but when he retired later than did I notice that he had left upon the table between our chairs the pocket-book, open to a page covered in his small precise hand, and at the top of the page underlined twice with the thin emphatic line of a conclusion reached. 2 words that he had evidently written at some point before this evening, and possibly before this morning. The words were, "Not Edmund." Chapter 8. The Contradiction. I have set down, in the various accounts I have made of Holmes's investigations, a great many instances of his capacity to construct an argument, and a somewhat smaller number of his capacity to demolish one. It is the latter faculty that I have always found the more remarkable, because construction is the work of intelligence applied to possibility, whereas demolition requires a subtler quality, the willingness to examine one's own most satisfying conclusions with the same scepticism one would bring to an adversary's. Holmes had permitted the monetary hypothesis to circulate for a day, had watched it settle comfortably into the household's assumptions, and had then, in the manner of a man who has been waiting for the tide to reach precisely the right mark, decided that the moment for its dismantling had arrived. He presented his case to me the following morning, not in the animated fashion he sometimes adopted when the pleasure of revelation outran his patience, but with the measured deliberation of a man who understands that the matter he is addressing requires the same care in its undoing that it required in its construction. Let us begin with what the financial theory actually proposes, he said. We were in our sitting room, the breakfast things cleared, the fire built up against the grey morning, and he stood with his back to it, which lent him the appearance of a lecturer before a class of one. It proposes that Edmund Denholm, knowing his father intended to alter the existing will in some fashion injurious to his financial interests, entered the study during the night, destroyed the codicil, and restored the door to its locked condition in order to conceal his visit. Motive, debt, means, access to the spare key, opportunity, the hours between Sir Alistair's retirement and the valet's discovery. Those three elements seem tolerably well established, I said. I was, I confess, playing the role of advocate for a position I no longer fully held, because I had understood from Holmes's manner that this performance had a purpose. They do, he agreed, and yet the theory contains a contradiction so fundamental that its apparent coherence becomes, upon examination, its primary flaw. He moved from the fire to the window and back, the short transit that indicated active thought rather than restlessness. Edmund's debt is £3,400, substantial but not catastrophic for a man who stands to inherit a Hampshire estate valued, at conservative estimate, at 12 times that figure. The existing will, as Gray has confirmed, provides adequately for Edmund's position. The existing will, in short, is Edmund's friend. I saw where this led, and I felt the clean satisfaction of a logical progression honestly followed. If the existing will already serves his interests, he had no reason to destroy an amendment he had not read. He could not have known whether the codicil helped him or hindered him. Precisely. And if the codicil had been financially injurious, its destruction would have drawn precisely the scrutiny upon him that it has in fact drawn. Scrutiny which any man of even moderate intelligence would have anticipated. Holmes stopped pacing. Edmund Denholm is not a clever man in the particular sense required for this affair, but he is not a foolish one. He would have known that the first question asked of anyone who destroys a will is, what did it say, and who benefited from its suppression? To destroy a document and leave behind a trail of debt is not cunning. It is an invitation. I turned this over and found it sound. And the monetary hypothesis had a shape that was pleasing from a distance and unconvincing upon approach, like a painting that flatters the general impression, but will not bear close examination. I said as much, and Holmes nodded with the brief acknowledgement of a man who wishes to press on. There is, however, a second observation which I consider the more decisive, he said, and his voice carried a quieter note that told me we had arrived at the true centre of the matter. When I informed the household yesterday morning that a creditor's inquiry had raised the question of Edmund's debts, I watched each of them receive that information. Edmund was alarmed, as a man is when he understands that his private difficulties have become public property. Gray was, as I described to you, quietly satisfied. Mrs. Denholm heard it, I thought, with something approaching relief, though she was too composed to make that relief visible. He paused, and I waited. Clara's response was different from all of them. He sat down, and there was nothing casual in the movement. When the suggestion of Edmund's culpability entered the conversation, Clara Denholm's anxiety did not diminish, it increased. I was still for a moment. You are certain of that? I am certain of what I observed. Her hands, which you will recall she works to keep controlled, became less controlled in the quarter hour following that conversation. She asked, in a fashion that she attempted to make seem incidental, whether Holmes had formed any other lines of inquiry. She sought out Gray, which she had not previously done, and their exchange, though conducted quietly, I had the character of a person seeking reassurance rather than information. If Edmund's guilt resolved the matter in her favour, I said slowly, working through it, why would she grow more anxious rather than less? Because she knows it is not Edmund. Holmes's voice was entirely level. A person who has destroyed a document and watches a false theory attach itself to another member of the household ought, if they are prudent, to accept that theories shelter and remain still. Clara's restlessness in the face of Edmund's apparent guilt suggests that she knows the theory is wrong and fears that someone else may discover it to be wrong, and that the discovery will then resume its natural direction. He pressed his fingertips together. She grew more anxious because she understood that the monetary hypothesis is insufficient, and she understood it to be insufficient because she knows precisely what the codicil contained, and she knows that its contents point in a direction that Edmund's debts, however convenient, do not cover. She knows, I said, because the codicil concerned her. It concerned her, and it concerned Mrs. Denholm's son, and it concerned the family's reputation in ways that Edmund's financial difficulties do not begin to touch. He rose from his chair with the decisiveness of a man who has finished with one stage of a proceeding and is ready to begin the next. Clara had reason to fear the codicil's existence. She had reason to want its destruction. But she is not the one who burned it, Watson, and that is a distinction I have not yet made fully clear to you. I looked at him with, I think, rather more surprise than I had expected to feel. Then you believe Clara knew of the document, feared it, but did not destroy it? I believe she knew of it. I believe her anxiety on the night of Sir Alistair's death was precisely the anxiety of someone who feared what he intended to write, and who may even have contemplated action, and who then found, upon the following morning, that the document had already been removed by another hand entirely. He took his coat from the back of the door. Her relief that morning was brief, Watson. I noted it and set it aside. What followed was the anxiety of a woman who understands that the person who preceded her had their own reason for the act, a reason that she had not anticipated, and which may yet produce consequences she cannot control. The distinction was a fine one, but I felt its weight. Clara had been afraid of the codicil and had considered what might be done about it. But between consideration and action, another person had already moved, with a steadiness and preparation that Clara's fear had not produced and could not match. Mrs. Denholm, I said. Mrs. Denholm, Holmes confirmed without triumph. He buttoned his coat with the neat economy of a man attending to a small thing in the interval before a larger one, whose composure this morning was the composure of a woman who has done what she believed was necessary and believes it to have succeeded, and who does not yet know, he said, opening the door, that she has been observed. He went out, and I followed, and the corridor received us in its panelled silence, and above the cold hearths of Withering Vale the matter lay very nearly complete, waiting only for the moment of assembly that Holmes was now, with unhurried precision, preparing to deliver. Chapter 9. The True Motive Revealed. Holmes sent word to Gray in the early afternoon, requesting that the principal members of the household assemble in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock. The request was phrased, as his requests invariably were in such circumstances, in terms that made it difficult to decline without appearing to have a reason for declining. Gray, I suspected, received it with the mixture of relief and apprehension that attends a man who has been waiting for a judgment he has not been certain he wanted delivered, and he communicated it to the others with the authority of a solicitor who understands that the moment of resolution, however uncomfortable, is preferable to the continuation of uncertainty. They were all present when we entered. Edmund occupied a chair to the right of the fireplace, with the settled wariness of a man who's been living under unspoken suspicion for 2 days, and has prepared himself to meet it face to face. Clara sat across from him on the small sofa, straight-backed, her hands folded upon her lap with a rigidity that suggested considerable effort. Mrs. Denholm had chosen a chair slightly apart from the others, near the window, and had brought her composure into the room with her like a garment she had dressed in with particular care. Young Thomas was not present. Gray stood near the door, his portfolio under his arm, the professional witness. Doctor. Hurst had placed himself at the far end of the room with the neutrality of a man who is present, because it would have been difficult to exclude him, and who intends, by positioning and stillness, to signal that he considers himself a bystander. I thought, looking at him, that he was not entirely successful in this ambition. A man who knows what he knows cannot fully inhabit the posture of someone who knows nothing. Holmes did not sit. He stood before the fireplace, which was unlit in the grey afternoon light, and he looked at each of them in turn with the brief, comprehensive attention that I had long since ceased to find discomforting, though it invariably had that effect upon those who encountered it for the first time. "I'm going to tell you what happened in this house on the night of Sir Alistair's death," he said, without preamble. "I shall do so as plainly as I can, because plainness, in my experience, is a courtesy, and this matter has been conducted in sufficient obscurity already." Nobody spoke. The fire that was not lit made no sound. Beyond the windows the November afternoon was failing, the light going from the garden by slow degrees. Sir Alistair Denholm spent the final evening of his life in his study, composing a document which he considered both necessary and long overdue. It was not a financial instrument. It contained no alteration to the distribution of his estate. It was a declaration, formal in character, intended ultimately to be witnessed and entered upon the record, which addressed two matters simultaneously. The first was the acknowledgment that a youthful indiscretion on the part of his daughter Clara had been concealed by Sir Alistair himself, at his own instigation, and for reasons he had come to believe were mistaken, since the concealment had served his own sense of propriety rather than her genuine interests. The second was a formal attestation of his complete satisfaction regarding the legitimacy of his marriage to Mrs. Margaret Denholm, and consequently of the standing of their son Thomas, in response to a private communication that had cast an insinuating doubt upon certain dates. I watched the room receive this. Edmund's expression shifted from wariness to something more complex, the recalibration of a man who's been expecting one blow and received another. Clara had gone very still, the study composure broken into something rawer and more genuine. Hurst looked at the floor. Gray's pen had stopped moving. Mrs. Denholm looked at Holmes without expression. The document, Holmes continued, was completed and left upon the desk. Sir Alistair retired. He died in the course of that night of natural causes, as Dr. Hurst has certified, and I have no grounds to dispute. The document was then entered into by someone who had prepared, over a preceding period, the means to move through that locked room quietly and without trace, and was burned in the study grate. The ash swept thoroughly away, and the room restored to the appearance of a room that had not been entered. The silence that followed was of a particular quality, the silence of a room in which several people are attending very carefully to a single point. The person who burned it, Holmes said, didn't act from greed. They acted from the conviction that the document, though benevolently intended, would cause more harm by its existence than by its absence. Sir Alistair, in his desire to set the record straight before he died, had not fully considered that a formal public declaration of Thomas's legitimacy would place upon the record the acknowledgement that his legitimacy had been questioned. It would draw the attention of precisely those elements of county society most disposed to perform the arithmetic that such declarations invite. The interval between the marriage and the child's birth falls within decency, but narrowly, and a formal document ratifying that interval is a document that directs eyes toward it. Mrs. Denholm had not moved. Her hands were in her lap, and her gaze was upon Holmes, and I could not read in her face anything that resembled guilt in its ordinary aspect. What I could read, and it cost me something to admit it, was the absolute coherence of a woman who has done what she did with full knowledge of what it was and full acceptance of what it cost. "You prepared the hinge," Holmes said to her directly and not unkindly. "You applied the preparation to the lock mechanism at some earlier date, when the pattern of Sir Alistair's final illness made it apparent that he was moving towards some formal act. You took the torn envelope containing the insinuating letter from the drawing-room desk and concealed it, though a fragment remained behind. You waited until Sir Alistair slept, entered his study, read the document he had written, understood that its public existence would accomplish the opposite of what he intended for your son, and burned it." Mrs. Denholm did not deny it. She looked at Holmes for a long moment, and then she looked at Clara, and the look she gave her carried an apology that was not for the act itself, but for the fear it had caused. Then she looked back at Holmes. "He meant it as a kindness," she said. Her voice was steady. He was in his way a kind man, but he did not understand that a kindness announced from a public platform is not always received as one. She paused. "Thomas is legitimate. My marriage was lawful. There is no doubt upon any point that matters, but a formal declaration entered into the record and available to any eye that chose to consult it would have served those who wished to harm my son better than it would have served Thomas himself." She folded her hands more deliberately in her lap. "I burned one sheet of paper, Mr. Holmes. I committed no other act." "You did not," Holmes agreed. And the paper contained no instruction that was legally binding in its draft form, no witness testament, no disposition of property. What it contained was a private acknowledgment, whose absence harms no one in any material or legal sense. Edmund was looking at Mrs. Denholm with an expression I could not entirely characterize. It was not sympathy, precisely, but it was not hostility either. It was the expression of a man who has found himself required, somewhat against his inclination, to revise an opinion. Clara had looked away toward the window, and I could see from the line of her shoulders that the particular species of vigilance she had maintained since our arrival had gone out of her like air from a held breath. Whether what replaced it was relief or grief or some compound of the two, I could not determine, and I thought it was not my place to inquire. Hurst cleared his throat and said nothing. Gray made a small note in his portfolio and closed it. "Money," Holmes said, almost to himself, or perhaps to the room in the aggregate, "may replenish itself. A man may recover a fortune, retire a debt, rebuild an income by patience and application. Reputation, once fractured and set into the public record, seldom submits to the same repair." He looked at Mrs. Denholm with a regard that contained, I thought, something approaching respect. "You understood that?" Sir Alistair did not quite. The difference between them was not one of affection for the child. It was one of understanding what the world does with the things it is shown. The afternoon had gone entirely by the time he stopped speaking, and the lamps had not yet been lit, and the drawing-room of Withering Vale held them all in the half-dark, each alone with what they now knew, while outside the last colour faded from the November sky, and the valley below the estate lay cold and still in the early coming of the dark. Chapter 10. The Restoration of Order. The household of Withering Vale did not dissolve at once after Holmes had spoken. Such things never do. The drawing-room emptied by degrees, each person withdrawing according to their own calculation of what the moment required of them. And the process was quiet enough that an observer who had arrived late might have supposed the assembly had merely concluded a routine domestic consultation. Only the lamps, when the servant finally came to light them, illuminated faces that were not quite as they had been an hour before. Holmes requested a private interview with Mrs. Denholm before dinner, and she granted it without hesitation and without apparent alteration of her composure. I was not present, nor did Holmes invite me to be, and I respected the decision as I had learned to respect all such decisions of his, not as a rebuff, but as a recognition that certain conversations carry a quality of privacy that the attendance of a third party, however trusted, would compromise. I spent the interval in our sitting room reading without great absorption, and listening to the house move around me. He returned at 6:30, in time to change for the dinner that the household had maintained with the disciplined regularity of people who understand that routine is, in grief and difficulty alike, a form of ballast. He said nothing of the interview until we were back in our sitting room after the meal, the others having retired early with the tacit agreement of people who have had enough of one another's company for the day. She confirmed everything, he said, settling into his chair, completely and without evasion. She understood, I think, that evasion at this stage would have cost her more than the truth. He picked up his pipe, considered it, and set it down again. She had watched Sir Alistair's deterioration with the particular alertness of a woman who depends for her child's security upon a single life, and who has calculated, with the precision that dependence enforces, every contingency that deterioration might produce. When it became apparent to her that he was moving towards some formal act, she began to prepare. The hinge, the lock. Those preparations were made over several weeks, not in haste and not in panic. She told me that she had not been certain she would use them. She hoped, she said, that his illness would forestall the document's completion, but she had prepared herself for the possibility that it would not. He was quiet for a moment. When Hurst visited Sir Alistair that final evening, and she observed the manner in which Sir Alistair received and dismissed him, she understood that the hour had come. She waited until she was satisfied that the house was settled, entered the study, read what had been written, and destroyed it. "And the envelope fragment behind the drawing-room desk?" I asked. The letter that had disturbed Sir Alistair's manner toward her. An anonymous communication from someone in the county, she believes, with an old interest in disputing the family's arrangement. She had found it before Sir Alistair could act upon it, and had concealed it, hoping to manage the matter quietly. In that she was less successful than she hoped, since Sir Alistair had evidently seen enough of its contents to be troubled, and had drawn his own conclusions about the need for a formal response. He folded his hands in his lap. She had not anticipated that his response would be the document it was. I sat for a while with all of this, turning it in my mind in the way one turns an object to find the angle at which it best resolves. There was, I reflected, a particular kind of case that refused the ordinary satisfactions of resolution, not the cases in which guilt is established and justice administered through their proper channels, which carry their own clean finality, but those in which the question of what justice requires cannot be answered by any tribunal that exists, because the act in question has done no legal harm to any living person, and the motive behind it was love rather than malice. "What do you intend to do?" I asked. Holmes looked at me with the directness he reserved for questions he considered important. "Sir Alistair died of natural causes. His will stands exactly as he originally drafted it. No money has been misappropriated, no property misrepresented, no living person materially injured. What Mrs. Denholm destroyed was a private document, unwitnessed and without legal force, which expressed a personal intention that died with the man who held it." He paused. "I was engaged by Sir Alistair to protect his interests. His interests were those of his household. His household includes Thomas, whom the document intended to protect, and whose protection, in its absence, remains as intact as it was before." Another pause, shorter than the first. "I cannot see that the public exposure of Mrs. Denholm's act serves any interest that Sir Alistair would have recognised as his own." It was not, I thought, a simple conclusion. It was one that Holmes had arrived at through the same rigour he applied to everything, and which had the merit of honesty. He was not excusing what had been done, but measuring its consequences with the same exactness he brought to its causes. The result was neither absolution nor condemnation. It was understanding, which is the rarest verdict and the one most seldom sought. We left Withering Vale the following morning. The household gathered in the hall to see us off with the correct expressions of gratitude, and beneath those expressions something less formal and more genuine, the particular relief of people who have been standing very close to an edge and who have been permitted, by a combination of circumstances and another's discretion, to step back from it. Edmund shook Holmes's hand with a firmness that contained, I thought, and the beginning of a revised estimation of himself and his responsibilities. He would settle his debts, I suspected, with a new seriousness, and manage the estate with rather more of the stewardship and rather less of the ownership that had characterised his tenure thus far. Whether I was right about this, I cannot say. I observed only the handshake and the expression that accompanied it, and formed the inference from those alone. Clara spoke briefly to me as the carriage was brought round, standing a little apart from the others in the cold morning air. She said that she was grateful, and did not specify for what, and I did not ask her to. She had the appearance of a woman at the first hour of a long-postponed relief, uncertain yet of what she would do with it, but certain at least that it was hers. Mrs. Denholm was the last. She stood at the foot of the steps with Thomas beside her. The boy puzzled by the formality of the occasion, in the way that children are puzzled by adult rituals whose significance they correctly sense but cannot yet decode. She looked at Holmes without speaking for a moment, and then she said very simply that she hoped he would have a comfortable journey. Holmes replied that he expected to, and that the Hampshire air had been, in all respects, instructive. In the carriage, as the gates of Withering Vale receded behind us, and the lane descended toward Petersfield in the wider world, I found myself reluctant to be the first to speak. The countryside moved past the windows in its late November undress, the trees bare, the fields colourless, the sky holding its light at that particular low angle that belongs exclusively to the short days of the year's end. "You're thinking," Holmes said at last, without looking up from the small notebook in which he had begun to write, "that justice was not served." "I am thinking," I replied with some care, "that I am not certain I know what justice required in this case, and that uncertainty itself strikes me as significant." He considered this for a moment. "It is significant," he said. "It is in fact the most honest response the case admits of." He closed the notebook. "We are accustomed, Watson, to thinking of justice as a restoration, the return of a situation to the condition it would have occupied had the wrong not been committed. But in this affair there is no condition to restore, because the document never acquired the force that would have made its destruction a material wrong. What was burned was an intention, and intentions, in law and in most of morality, require completion before their suppression becomes an injury. Yet the whisper remains," I said. "Someone in that county sent the letter that disturbed Sir Alistair. That person still exists, and still holds whatever they believe they know." "Yes." Holmes looked out of the window at the passing Hampshire lanes. "The whisper remains. It will perhaps always remain in one form or another, in houses like that one. The codicil was burned, but the impulse that produced it was not. Sir Alistair understood that something needed to be set right. He was not wrong in that understanding. He was wrong only in his sense of how the world receives the setting right of things. I watched the valley floor pass below the lane and thought of Thomas, walking in the kitchen garden with his mother's hand in his, unknowing, unconcerned, entirely himself. The question of what the world would eventually make of him was not one I could answer, and I did not try. "Society," Holmes said, returning to his notebook as though the observation were a footnote rather than a conclusion, "values appearance over truth in proportion to the degree to which the truth is inconvenient. That is not a comfortable proposition, but it is a reliable one." He wrote something brief and closed the notebook again. What Mrs. Denholm understood, and what Sir Alistair did not quite, is that the appearances of Withering Vale were not merely vanity. They were the medium through which a child's future would be conducted. To disturb them without necessity was to risk that future for the sake of a principle that the future itself could not afford. He said nothing more, and I did not press him. The carriage carried us on toward Petersfield, and behind us the house stood in its valley as it had stood for 2 centuries, its stones holding their silence as stones do, indifferent to the small human dramas that had played out within them and would play out again in other forms, in other seasons. The whisper of Withering Vale faded, as whispers do, into the general quiet of the Hampshire morning. Yet its echo, as echoes will, persisted in my memory long after the facts of the case had settled into the order that years impose upon all things, the order not of resolution, but of acceptance, which is in the end the only order that most of life's difficult matters ever truly find.